welcome back, Down Below. This is our ninth
I think so. We were 2 months
developer
last
discussion?
week.
Yes, ninth developer discussion. 9. That's... I don't have a joke ready to go for 9.
It's one more than 8, so sue us. We're tired. It's a long day.
One more than spiders.
There we go.
So, we were going to talk about resolving scenes and the Russian mob today, and we're going to change things up and talk about mechanics first, because I've got a lot of ideas about resolving scenes. So,
Yep.
in our game, the transition from one scene to the next and the overall flow of action scenes in your game session is actually really important to the system. When you decide, okay, I'm going to call it a scene here and move on to the next one, that is something that you don't necessarily explicitly communicate to your players, because they don't technically need to know, but it is something that you as a GM should really keep track of, because all of the methods that we have written and that we are going to be writing into the game system and various published material to build adventures off of, and all of the tools that we're going to try and set up for you are built on the basis of build these little set-piece scenes and then use how they resolve to decide what you're going to do next.
Talking a little bit about what a scene is and how to resolve it, and don't worry, I promise this digression won't go on too long, because we do have limited time. An interesting thing to note about scenes is the reason a lot of RPGs don't divide it up neatly into movie-style story-based scenes is because objectives are usually things to be accomplished. This does lead to some weird narrative anticlimax, where often the villain will lean in to deliver his great zinger at the end, thus demoralizing the people who are being intimidated. And in a movie, the camera would cut away and we'd move on to the next scene. But in a traditional RPG, well, no, we haven't actually finished things. We're in combat time, and the rogue is going one initiative take after him and is going to give him a kick mid-speech, and so his voice breaks in the middle of the one-liner, or the villains laugh at, oh my god, how corny was that zinger.
This is also partly because many GMs deliver their villains one-liners at inopportune moments because they haven't learned to recognize where in the timing of the system they're using the villain can get away with the zinger without getting kicked in the balls.
We are encouraging a bit of the opposite. We are not encouraging people to ignore the actions of the players or to remove player agency, but we are also encouraging the use of the dramatic cutaway, the use of the cinematic, we're done here, and hey, now we're in the next scene, and what just happened, you guys, and let's establish what happened once we've established where we are now.
We talked a bit about the whole succeed X number of times before you fail Y number of times. That's where you set up this cutoff.
Mm-hmm.
So the point where you're going to resolve a scene is the point where X or Y has been fulfilled.
Yep.
If they've gotten the 10 successes that they needed for the violent solution to this scene, for example, so all 10 or 10 out of the however many guys with guns who were backing them into a corner have been knocked out or driven off, and they've succeeded. This is where you resolve the scene in a successful way, in a, okay, you guys got what you came for, or drove off the people harassing you, or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, if you were doing for example, 10 successes before 5 failures, and the players failed 5 times, this is where, okay, you've all been wounded or captured, and now we're going to move on to you guys, whatever you have planned for that eventuality. Maybe they wake up in some kind of hospital. Maybe they wake up in some kind of captivity. Maybe they're not actually unconscious, but they're all put into handcuffs, and the big bad comes in to deliver one-liners while they're actually tied up and can't kick them in the balls.
One of the important things here is something that a lot of players will balk at. No, when the scene ends, you can't get one last, but wait, you can't get one last parting shot. You can't get one last, I wanted to you're done. When the scene ends, we move on. In the movies, again, you might get some flashbacks to players, to our characters, basically saying, "Hey guys, you remember when you blah blah blah? Oh yeah, I totally remember you doing that." But when the scene is over, except in flashbacks, that's it. You move forward, you move on. Sometimes it's as simple as narrating, "Here are the consequences," and sometimes it's more complicated and in media res. In the aftermath of an escape scene, for instance, instead of detailing how you all pile into the car and you drive away at a sedate but not too sedate pace, the opposite direction so the cop cars coming in don't see you, maybe instead you're just going to cut to 30 minutes later at the safe house. So guys, okay, let's go over what just happened.
Now, if players really want to do something directly reacting to how you're resolving a scene, you shouldn't cut too long or too far. And this is the first... this is where I'm going to get into some specifics of specifically resolving scenes. There are a few basic methods of cut to the next scene. One of the basic methods is the jump cut. The jump cut is where the players don't have anything that they want to happen immediately. So you get to narrate, this is what happens, and X amount of time later, jump cut.
3 years later.
Sometimes it might even be a long time later if you're not only ending a scene, but a story.
Yep.
Because, well, okay, you guys have totally finished with that, and nothing else interesting happens until...
Dr. Doom is imprisoned, and the World Devastator Ray has been successfully dismantled. No new villains will arise for a while. 3 years later...
Note, you probably won't have those specific characters or plot elements in this game, but you could use a similar system for a superhero game. So, but the next type is the opposite of that. And when players want to directly react to your narration of the end of the scene, the next type is the sort of a more of a panning cut, because you're not actually cutting away, you're just cutting to a new angle on new action in relation to how the scene just resolved. So here are some concrete examples of these two ends of the spectrum. And this particular spectrum that we're dealing with is how much you gloss over in cutting away from the end of the scene.
Yep.
At the extreme end, you have, all right, you guys escaped successfully from your heist at the warehouse, you got the item, and we are going to pick this up when you meet with your contact, because in between you have successfully escaped pursuit and you just lay low until the meeting and the pursuit won't catch up with you. We already established that. So it is 18 hours later, you had a meal, you've slept, and you're waiting for your contact at the appointed location.
Yep.
And then you start narrating that scene, and maybe their contact is late and they get worried and they have to do something about that, or maybe the contact shows up on time, but there's some other complication. Because obviously when you're starting to narrate a new scene, there's going to be complications, because otherwise it wouldn't be the interesting part to narrate. Then on the other extreme you have, and this will happen especially often in a scene where the players have chosen failure, because there is nothing that gets a player to react to a situation like you are in a situation where bad stuff is happening because you failed at something.
Mm-hmm.
So let's say in the same warehouse heist, they failed to get the thing, and in this case, the thing is driving away in an armored car, and they were pinned down under fire, but now they've actually simply been muscled out of the warehouse, but they're not being shot at once they leave the vicinity because A, they're no longer in the vicinity that the guards are guarding, and B, the thing that they were trying to get has already left, so there's no reason for the PCs to say. So, after that last failure that met your failure condition, you narrate them being driven off by the gunfire, which then trails off as they get out of the area, and you narrate how they saw the vehicle drive away and get away from them. Well, now the players are clamoring to try and start to chase that vehicle, and so what you need to do is narrate the transition to what they're going to try and do to catch up with it.
Interestingly, there is a bit of finesse here, because it's quite possible that the players, for whatever reason, do not narrate, do not say, hey, we want to chase after them. It's possible the players might say, hey, we need to try another attack, and this is an appropriate time for a jump cut to later on. It's alternately possible that someone might say, when starting off the scene, instead of chasing after them, I'm going to spend a success to have already planted a tracking device on the armored car, and so we're going to wait until it stops moving. And there again is time for a possible jump cut or a possible delay cut to later. But it's all in it's finesse in the reaction here. You're giving the players the opportunity to react,
right,
and then deciding what you're going to do.
There are, as mentioned, some reactions that they might take that necessitate a jump cut of sorts rather than an immediate cut. So, differentiating between do you want to make a lot of time pass or make no time pass before you go into the next scene is based on the type of action the players are taking. Should this be something where the next interesting action is going to happen now or a while from now? And that can be a tricky decision to come to, but you can get a feel for it by thinking step by step through what the players are doing. If the players are going into, we need to track down this van, then what skills are they going to use? Are they immediately going to jump in a car and use driving and navigation to follow that van? Then you're transitioning immediately into a chase scene. Are they going to get onto the internet and start figuring out, okay, where does that van go? How can we cut it off? Mm-hmm. Then you're going into an investigation info gathering scene. Similarly, if they're going into more talking to people based information gathering, if they're trying to catch up with the cargo that way. Are they going for we know where they're going, we'll try to cut them off and fight them there? Then you're doing a small jump cut to the next fight that they get into at the next destination. Or you might have something that you have planned for the failure condition that goes into an immediate scene. Because if the failure condition for a scene would logically put the players under an NPC's power,
or even under pressure,
or even under whether subject to an NPC's actions or under pressure from an outside condition, you then have created a situation where you are narrating, well, before you guys can go off and do whatever you want, whether in relation to your current story goals or bringing up something else that you're like, well, it's not directly from what we were doing, but I've wanted to get this done for a while, and so.
So let's actually bring up a possible concrete example of this. Let's go back to our warehouse example. We're going with 10 successes of any type before 5 failures of any type. It is entirely possible that a failure might result in something simple and concrete, such as one of the PCs is taken out of the action whether unconscious or dead. It's alternately possible that failures that are not directly related to the health of a PC are abstracted a little differently. The end goal of the enemies is to get the MacGuffin out of the warehouse via their armored car. So it's basically a time-based thing. If there's a failure that is not directly related to a PC becoming unconscious, you don't necessarily have to narrate that as And slowly, inexorably, the briefcase moves further towards the armored car. You could alternately say something such as, the wailing of sirens in the distance gets closer because someone early on in the fight called the cops or they heard the gunfire or whatnot. And so various police forces would be arriving. Never mind that we talked a lot about how Nuevo Paradiso didn't have a traditional police force in the last one. We're using a real-world example for this. So, let's say that the 5 successes are one of them took a PC to unconscious, but the other 4 were just general successes, delay successes, as it were. In this case, since something you wanted the PCs to have to do was to deal with the repercussions of being stuck on the crime scene when the police arrive, as the armored car is peeling out, so too are the police cars pulling in. And while the scene resets, it flows seamlessly into the SWAT team storms the building with their riot shields and shotguns.
And now the PCs have to deal with a separate problem of you are now under siege by this SWAT team, instead of dealing with the situation that they wanted to deal with, which was the armored car and the briefcase that they let get away, because they've been put into that scenario.
In a very real sense, the difference between narrative success and narrative failure can often be summed up as a question of which side of the GM screen gets to dictate the next scene. In a narrative success situation, the players will most likely be dictating the next scene. In a narrative failure situation, the DM will most likely be dictating the next scene.
However, this is not a hard and fast rule, as the examples we've given show. Basically, what narrative success and failure always hard and fast mean is that with a narrative success, the characters of the players will get closer to their stated goals as the players have been describing their actions.
And with a narrative failure, the goals of the other players will probably actually get farther away because simply staying still is boring.
And narrative failure is actually, in some ways, a little bit broader than narrative success, because narrative success is always definitely the goals that the players said their characters were actively working towards right now, and described themselves as doing in the scene. Narrative failure, however, is sometimes going to have losses come into effect that are not directly related to what the players and their characters thought they were trying to get done. Sometimes what happens is instead other stuff goes wrong, and that's what gets in the way right now, and it doesn't necessarily set you back in the immediate sense so much as in a long-term sense. It is actually possible with narrative failure for you as the GM to decide, based on the type of narrative failures you took, because it was all stuff that was sort of social and informational, vague failure that I didn't feel had a direct relationship with what I felt was the direct plot that you were going for, I'm going to bring this failure to you on a personal level and say that the contacts that you were getting in touch with, you have a falling out with those contacts, and you actually got the information that you wanted, but now you've got
using it again.
Now you've got people pissed at you, people who you thought were your best friends, or maybe you're pissed at them because they stabbed you in the back. Something like that. You can use narrative failure in a lot of different ways, and you can actually advance the story. If you as the GM want the story to advance in exactly the same way the PCs want it to advance, you can use narrative failure to advance the story despite the character's failure, but give them in-character, interesting complications that they have to deal with to make their world interesting and difficult at the same time.
To go back to the example I used for one of the long-term jump cuts, the Fantastic Four versus Doctor Doom and his World Devastator Ray, in the event of a narrative success, congratulations, Fantastic Four, you stopped Doctor Doom, the World Devastation Ray is dismantled, and Doctor Doom is put away in jail, and we can move on to the next villain. in a narrative failure, congratulations, Fantastic Four. You stopped Doctor Doom. The World Devastator Way is dismantled, and Doctor Doom is put away, and the ethics of your actions are called up front and center in the national media, and you have to deal with the fallout of that.
And while you're at the press conference, Baby Franklin disappears.
There you go.
Because Baby Franklin always disappears.
And it's probably time travel.
It's always time travel.
So, yeah, narrative success or failure can both be used to move the story forward and transition into the next scene.
So, let's talk about Russians.
Let's talk about Russians. So, let's specifically start with talking about what is the Mafia, or rather, what is the Russian Mafia. This is somewhat true of the classical Italian Mafia as well, but it's very true of what's known as the Russian Mafia. The Russian Mafia is a collection of loosely organized criminal, smaller gangs or syndicates that are generally pointed in the same direction.
In our time, in our world, a large portion of the organized crime coming out of Russia is organized by people who are former KGB and other former Soviet state people who have a lot of secretive, thuggish skills and just continued to apply those skills even when they weren't officially government.
The group that is most often associated with it, it bears some resemblance to the Sicilian group by similar terms. The Sicilian group is the Cosa Nostra, who would eventually go down as the Mafia, the family, basically. The Russian group of a similar name and bent is the Vory-Vizikone. I'm probably pronouncing it wrong. I don't actually speak Russian. But the Vory roughly translates to thieves in law. The origins of this are that these are the people who would hold a very high standard of life in prison culture. They are the thieves or the criminals that would be arrested multiple times, and at the outset of this tradition, there was actually a code that had a variety of such things, such as a variety of identifiers, such as at the point where you become one of the Vory, when you become a thief in law, you will not ever own any property or hold any legal office. You will never take any money that was not earned through thievery, basically. The definition of theft expands to pretty much everything that is considered licit by Vory code, but it basically boils down to, no, you don't hold a regular job. Your entire income is through your life of crime. You start to see the prison as your actual home, not actually the time outside. There's a lot of interesting tenets in there, but it really is a brotherhood of thieves who uphold who in the classically upheld a moral code, not in the sense that the traditional Robin Hood or self-styled Yakuza do, but more accurately as a duty to their other fellow thieves in law. Honor among thieves was very much their thing.
Now, let's establish a couple ground rules for people who aren't familiar with Russian organized gangsters and how they operate. The first descriptor which comes to mind is brutality. The Russians are violent when it comes to crime families. This is not to say that other types of organized criminal are not violent. This is to say that the level of violence displayed by the Russians shocks the other criminals.
If a Sicilian family wants to take some turf away from another family, they will start with veiled threats. They will continue on through offers. They will eventually start taking underhanded moves and might rise to the level of assassination. And only in the direst of situations will there be actual street wars. If a Russian family decides to take areas from another family, they will first inform the other family that they want the area, and then if an arrangement is not immediately reached, they will probably drive a car through their living room.
Specifically, the Russians are known for when they do hostile takeovers, which is the immediate next step, as noted, after failing to immediately agree to their terms of takeover.
If you're going to offer terms, your terms had better start with, "We will do what you want. In exchange, can you?"
Exactly. there's a little room for negotiation, but you got to be really well versed in their culture to get anywhere with it. They typically kill all of the people who are working for the other organization in that area, and then install their own people instead.
This has traditionally been a problem, so what has often happened is that they will kill everyone above a certain level who is working for that organization, co-opt the people below the organization, and if certain members happen to vanish before they die but don't actually jump right back into that local criminal underworld, that's okay too, because blood is kind of hard to get out. But that's not them saying, yeah, sure, we'll let you go. That's just them saying it's a little bit easier for all concerned if we say you're functionally dead, and you will be dead if you come back.
And besides, you running away to tell people how scary we are fits with our image and our interests.
Speaking of image, by the way, as with all of these discussions of criminal organizations, we are fictionalizing and sensationalizing more than a little bit. This is reference for not just pop culture descriptions. There is a lot of real world work that goes into these descriptions. But most importantly, this is the way it is working traditionally in the world we're designing in the future.
Yep.
If any of you are actually connected with these organizations, I won't say we're sorry, but we mean no offense.
So, starting that sentence over. The other main descriptor that you need to know about the Russians is loyalty. And they take this word to mean, well, something different than the other organizations. All criminal organizations run on loyalty. The Yakuza run on loyalty to the point where they have the whole proof of loyalty by getting the tattoos and by cutting off sections of finger when you have failed in some of the most traditional cells of Yakuza families. And the Cosa Nostra Mafia have loyalty to the family and
their various tests of loyalty,
the entire plot of every Godfather movie and the entire plot of The Sopranos, and that
the
is
entire plot of
hugely
Scarface,
spread.
for crying out loud. You're not even talking about a crime family. You're talking about a ground-up syndicate, and it still boils down to loyalty.
The entire plot of every gangster movie ever centers around loyalty because it is a big thing, and despite that, I can still say that the Russians do loyalty differently, and they treat it as even more sacred. Because in the Russian mob culture, loyalty is something that each member of the Brotherhood must show independently of each other member. It's not just a mutual loyalty thing, which the Italian mob family thing is very much a mutual loyalty thing, and if one side breaks the loyalty, then the other side will often take revenge for the breach of loyalty. But in the Russian mob, more so than in just about any other organization of organized crime, if one member breaches loyalty, that does not in any way mitigate the obligations of loyalty that all the other members have, not only to each other, but to that person. And any retribution that is done to that person, and don't get me wrong, they do seek retribution on people who betray them. That's part of loyalty being important. But they don't do it out of a sense of, you've betrayed us, you're not one of us. They seek retribution on their members in a very different way, in a way that acknowledges that they are a member of the group, and often they will do things not necessarily less violently, but in a way that attempts to remind that member of their duty and bring them back.
During the Second World War, there was a series of prison wars fought, and I mean actual straight-up prison wars, not just riots, but long, drawn-out affairs between two factions of criminals. The first were the Vori, those who had sworn to be the Brotherhood of Thieves, those who had sworn to say, no law but our own, no law but that of the thief. And the second, I shall not actually name because this is largely PG, and I'm not going to swear too much on air. The second faction were being persecuted by the Vori because during the Second World War, they had joined up with the Russian army to fight the German invaders. That's right. They hadn't betrayed any criminal secrets. They had not turned in their criminal brethren. All they had done was sign on after joining the Brotherhood, after saying we are convicted felons and we are proud of it, and we are criminals for life. They had said, and for right now, hang on, we're not going to be criminals. We're going to help push the invader back from our motherland. And people did not like that and went to war with them because they followed an authority other than that of the thief by law. It was long, it was bloody, it was full of retribution, but it wasn't retribution over a betrayal of you said you wouldn't do this and you did this. It was a deeper betrayal of not just you stabbed us in the back, but you walked away from the code that we're upholding here. And if we don't,
which also illustrates one of the very important aspects of the Vori Code. Unlike many other organized crime families, similar, however, to the triads, the Vori consider themselves to be outside of the law of nations. Now, it is distinct and different from the triads because the triads consider themselves to be above and outside the law. It doesn't apply to them. They consider themselves to be a separate sovereign entity, and nations don't matter to them. The Vori, on the other hand, consider nations and governments to be their enemy by existing.
Which leads us directly to why the Vori are flourishing in Nuevo Paradiso. This is a place outside of place. This is a world where nations basically don't exist. And so when an organization of people who have sworn themselves to be criminals by law, who have forever forsworn the idea of fitting in with civilized law-abiding society, move in to an area that they're not pushed out by their very illegal nature. And when it's mentioned that the Voris are thieves by law, that doesn't mean that they make all their living by pushing people over and stealing their lunch money. Many of the activities that are deemed illicit by Russian law and thus licit by Vori code are things that are simply services on Nuevo Paradiso. When a Vori headsman decides to make a living by extracting protection money from a neighborhood of shops, that actually, when that extends to services they still do in Russia. In Russia, if you are under the protection of a gang, that gang will go out of their way to make sure that the rent money you are paying is actually bearing fruit for you, as opposed to the Gotham gangster that is fictionalized, where they really couldn't care less if you can make your rent on time.
And, well, let's face it, in the Nuevo Paradiso idiom, let's compare Yakuza who take protection money to Vori who take protection money. Yakuza who take protection money, you might be able to go to them to lean on somebody who's not Yakuza who's giving you trouble, and you shouldn't get much trouble from the local Yakuza, and if you're in Yakuza territory, probably not much trouble from anybody else as long as you're paying up your protection money. But the Yakuza will come round for their protection money and will bust up your place if you don't give it, regardless of whether you've, had trouble with your business recently. The Vori, on the other hand, if you pay protection money to your local Vori and you're in Vori territory, they will make absolutely sure that their word to you is kept, because that is part of their code.
If you are paying Sergei your rent money, not only are you likely to have tea with Sergei on a regular basis, because Sergei's actually a pretty cool guy and takes an interest to how your shop is running, if you are a baker who is paying Sergei rent money and your bread deliveries are being slowed down by bad roads, Sergei is likely to either take into account that fact and reduce your protection payments, or possibly go lean on the city officials to fix the roads so that his businesses can function.
Part 2. The reason why it's being referred to in the case of the Russians as rent money sometimes, as well as protection money, is because the Russians, unlike the Yakuza, unlike the Triads, they tend to make sure that they own the buildings. They will be your landlords as well as your local gangsters, because they will make sure, and they will often do this through skullduggery and violence rather than legitimately purchasing the buildings because of their code, because they live outside the law, but they will be owning this territory and setting up their entire territory as they control it, no one else. Not even any other legal owner or authority.
Another major difference. If you renege on a deal with the Yakuza or the Mafia or the Triads, and you survive the initial betrayal and the subsequent firefight, etc., etc., even if you make reparations, even if they extract their fictional or literal pound of flesh from you, that's it. You are on their blacklist. With the Vori, if you break an agreement or you renege on a deal or something bad happens, and they're after you to make it right, and you make it right, there will be pats on the back, and you will go out for drinks, and everything will be forgotten because you made it right and accidents happen.
Side note, if they've decided that the punishment for you stiffing them is breaking your legs, and they break your legs, when you get out of the hospital, Sergei will invite you to tea. Because they broke your legs. That was the punishment. They're done.
It's also possible that Sergei, instead of calling you an ambulance, will drive you to the hospital himself, apologizing for the pain you're in. Because they've extracted punishment, now let's get your legs fixed.
Because he's sorry that this was necessary, but really, you knew that you had the money at the time, and you chose to spend it on something other than making good your agreement, and he cannot let people get the idea that that is an okay thing to do, so he had to break your legs. But he likes you, so he only broke your legs and not your skull.
Lastly, the final major difference in the way that business is conducted between the Russian Mafia in Nuevo Paradiso and most of the other criminal organizations in Nuevo Paradiso is the barter system. If you owe a Mafia Don a significant debt, and instead of being able to pay the debt, you're able to offer favors, that does not go towards erasing the debt. That is something you do to keep them from breathing down your neck while you work really hard on scraping up the money. In fact, sometimes they will ask for favors that you can provide that will distract you from the ability to get the money just to keep you on their good side longer. Similarly, sometimes once you've actually paid off the debt, they'll still keep asking you for favors because they know you're good for it, and you wouldn't want those times you'd helped us before to count against you. If you owe the Vori a large sum of money, and you are not able to pay back that money, but you are able to offer them services that they could not obtain internally, those services will count, in at least a small part, towards repayment of the debt.
And they will tell you how much.
And they will honor that because that's business, because that is the way their system works outside the normal law.
Now, this is not to say that others won't ever do this. That deals can be made for reduction of debt with others, but this is to say that this is the kind of deal that will usually be offered up front with favors with the Russians, whereas the Triads especially will often imply something and then say, oh, we never said that we were going to do that.
If you are a fishing boat owner and you owe Sergei $10,000 that you borrowed so you could buy the boat, and the fishing season has been very bad, Sergei might simply say, hey, the next time you go out, if you would drop this overboard, I will count it as $2,000 off your debt. And it will be $2,000 off your debt. No, that does not absolve you of interest. If there was any interest that's accruing, it's still accruing. But he will take $2,000 off the principal of the debt. Right there, right then, as soon as you dump it overboard.
And on Sergei's ledger, it will list $2,000 credit for delivery service.
Yep. So, basically, in closing, we haven't gone into a lot of personalities in the Russian mafia, and that's something I kind of wanted to do, and I'll probably get to that next week. But the big differences between the Russian mafia and most of the others is that, unlike the others, they see themselves straight up as criminals, but they also take that to mean something very differently than most people. They treat business as something that is honestly fairly sacred, and they're more like landlords than, well, even though they are leg breakers, than leg breakers.
So they break more skulls than anybody else, and legs and other things, but they also take more helpful hand in the people who are their people.
If the Yakuza are caretakers and the Triads are extorters, then the Vori are more like gardeners.
So, thank you once again for descending beneath society with us. And next week we will go into some specific personalities that populate Nuevo Paradiso's Vori families. And we're going to talk about what makes a good success trait on a character sheet mechanically. Because we've talked a lot about this, and there's some written about that in the part of the rules that we do have written up, which there is a link to in our Patreon. But let's talk about it in a developer sense so that we can talk more of it out.
That sounds like a plan to me.
Thank you, and until next week.